Good morning again, everybody. This is the second podcast of three, then that is taking you through the political ideas that underpin our study of German history between 1871 and 1990. In the first podcast, we focused on the political left. This one will focus on the political right. Okay, so again, we're starting off with a screenshot of the handout that you've got. So it'll be useful if you've got that handout in front of you as I take you through the key points, so that you can pause the podcast and reference it. There is the social pyramid. I don't think I need to talk about that any further. We developed the point about that in the previous podcast. And there again is the political spectrum, and that social pyramid at the bottom turned sideways on. That's important, just a quick word on that, because obviously we've got the range of political ideas from left through to right, and what we did last time is we focused in on the left-wing ideas, and the social pyramid at the bottom is obviously telling you the sort of voting base, which social classes on the whole tended to vote for which political ideas. So we developed in the previous podcast the fact that it tended to be the urban working classes whose vote would be more towards the political left, and again the middle classes and the upper classes, their vote tended to be more towards the political right. And what we're doing today is we're focusing in on the political right. Remember, though, that that is a generalisation. It is fairly simplistic. As we go through the course, we'll obviously be developing all sorts of exceptions to that rule, but in terms of securing your basic understanding, that's a fairly useful concept, that the higher up in the social pyramid you move, in other words, as you move towards the middle classes and the upper classes, the more likely the political views will shift to the centre and to the right. The left-wing views tended to come from the poorer social classes, the urban working classes. Okay, so right-wing conservative nationalist ideas. So what we're doing here is we're very much focusing in on the right-wing views in our social pyramid. Okay, what exactly does that mean? Okay, well, those groups on the political right are often referred to as either conservative or nationalist. Okay, either term is used. Sometimes they may be linked. Historians may talk about the national conservatives. So that's a term that I'm using in this particular PowerPoint. Okay. Something else to remember is that from the previous podcast, remember that on the left wing, we call it socialism. Socialist views were generally about redistributing wealth, taking from the rich to the poor. On the right wing, the views tended to be more about allowing those people who have the wealth, the middle classes and the upper classes, to keep that wealth. Okay, so the more you move towards the right wing, the more you get that sort of view that wealth should be retained by those classes. And the exact opposite, and we'll develop this in this podcast, whereas the left-wing views were internationalist, obviously the right-wing views were nationalist. And nationalism is about pride in your country. That is the most important thing. It is about people of all social classes working together for their country. Okay, and that sort of concept is, I've illustrated it in this particular diagram, so let's have a look at it. Okay, so again, we've got two countries, country A and country B. Now, the gap between the triangles, remember, implies the tensions that exist within countries between the middle classes who hold on to the majority of the power, and the working classes who sit at the bottom of the pyramid. They are the largest group, but they are effectively exploited. Okay, and so that gap between the two triangles implies literally there is a physical gap. There's a difference of wealth, but there is also tensions between them. And as we saw last time, that those tensions, Karl Marx theorised that they would lead eventually to the working classes rising up and overthrowing the middle classes, and that would be an international movement where working classes of different countries would unite together against the middle classes of different countries. Now, the conservative nationalist view, the right-wing view, obviously is fearful of that happening. The middle classes and the upper classes want to keep their power base. Okay, so if you have right-wing views, again, I think probably if we just use the bullet points on the right, okay, they view the model that we're looking at here as being good. Power lies with an educated middle class who make decisions that will strengthen the country. That's where power lies. If you're right-wing, you tend to believe that power should lie with a minority of people, the people who are best fit to rule. That if you're right-wing, you believe that if you admit the majority, the masses, the working classes, into power, then power will become diluted and it will not be effective. Okay. Secondly, the nationalists and conservatives believe that if you allow the middle classes to hold on to power in a country, then capitalism can flourish. Now, capitalism is that sort of view that Marx despised. Capitalism is the view that if you work hard, then you should be allowed to keep that wealth for yourself. It shouldn't be redistributed, okay? And that sort of model of working hard, you can keep your wealth, it provides an incentive to work even harder, and that is good for everybody, so everybody in the end will gain. That's sort of the capitalist view, okay? It's very much of a middle class view, okay, that wealth can be kept by those people who work hardest. Thirdly, revisit that idea of a national boundary separating the country. So the national boundary is represented by that vertical line. Okay, now in the previous model, the left-wing political views, we saw that if you're a socialist, if you're from the lower classes, you actually want to break down that national boundary, because what you want to do if you're a socialist is you want working classes of the world to unite together. National boundaries stop that happening. Clearly, though, if you are a conservative nationalist, if you're on the right wing, you believe that the national boundary is good, because that national boundary can create national unity. Okay, it prevents the workers of the world uniting together. And if you've got national boundaries, what it will do, and this is what's represented by this arrow here and there, okay, is it will effectively bind together the middle classes and the lower classes of the same country. That nationalism, pride in your country, putting your country first, encourages the working classes and the middle classes to work together, not against each other, as the socialists want to happen. Okay, so in other words, they view their enemies as the people of other countries, not their fellow countrymen. People on the right wing of politics would say, whether you are a middle class or working class, what you've got in common is you all belong to this country, and we should therefore work together, not against each other. Our enemies are people in other countries, and we should be pulling together people of our country, of all classes, to fight against the enemies of other countries. Okay. Now, that's sort of a very generalised statement of conservative nationalism. There's obviously a wide spectrum of beliefs within it, and again, if you think of that first diagram, the political spectrum, you've got views that range from moderate to extreme. So let's just pick out the differences between them. Okay, so that just sort of like reinforces the point we made. So the national boundary therefore distracts the working classes from dangerous socialist ideas that might encourage them to view the middle classes as their enemies. Okay, so that national boundary, in a sense, is really important if you are on the right wing of the political spectrum, because it distracts the working classes from pulling together and working with the working classes of other countries. It prevents that actually happening, and by doing that, if you've got that national boundary, the working classes will then think in terms of the middle classes of their country as a friend. Okay, so let's, as I say, break it down into extreme nationalists. So think of our political spectrum that we saw in the earlier diagram, the views from left to right, and remember you've got on the two extremes, you've got extreme left and extreme right. So what we did about socialism in the previous podcast, you have the extreme socialists who we call communists, and then we have the moderate socialists who we in Germany would have called the Social Democrats, okay, the Social Democratic Party. Now, on the right wing of the political spectrum, again, you've got to be ever so careful not to talk in simplistic terms, because there were extreme nationalists and there were moderate nationalists. Okay, now, let's start off with the extreme. If you're an extreme nationalist, you take so seriously your pride in your country and this concept of working classes and middle classes pulling together to create unity. Okay, that nationalism is good because it creates unity within the country, because it gets rid of conflict and tension between the social classes. So you take that so seriously that you think, well, what's the most extreme form of national pride? Well, the most extreme form of national pride is that war is when two countries go to war against each other. And therefore war must be a good thing, because when one country goes to war against another, then national unity will result. Okay, so if Britain goes to war against France, the working classes and the middle classes of Britain, who might otherwise have been arguing with each other, will put aside their differences. They will all work together, because now they have another enemy. The enemy is France, rather than the enemy being each other. So what war does is effectively it creates that unity. The workers and the middle classes will unite against a common enemy. So again, there's that concept, it's reinforcing what we said earlier. What nationalism does and what war does as an extreme form of nationalism, it distracts the working classes away from those dangerous internationalist socialist ideas that we looked at in the previous podcast. Those international socialist ideas that workers of the world should be linking together and waging a common war against the rich of the world, okay? And those ideas are obviously internationalist. That's the sort of extreme nationalist point of view. Now, obviously, the most obvious example of that in terms of German history, people who believed in that concept were the National Socialists, the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, and we'll develop that concept more as we move through the course. But also more closer to where we are at the moment in terms of the Second Reich, that concept was grabbed hold of after Bismarck had resigned, in particular by Chancellor Bülow, who was Chancellor of Germany from 1900 onwards, when Kaiser Wilhelm II was Emperor of Germany. That sort of concept that expanding abroad, pursuing the race for colonies, was a way of distracting the socialists of Germany, in particular the rising power of the Social Democratic Party. It was a way of distracting them from dangerous internationalist ideas, that nationalism was a good thing that would pull Germany together. Okay, so just to summarise then, okay, again I'll just quickly zoom in. There's that political spectrum idea. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at that again. It's a good opportunity. So remember what we said is that you can take these words socialism, but it covers a broad range. Okay, you've got extreme, the communists, and moderate socialism, who were exemplified in Germany by the SPD. Okay, well, it's the same with the right wing that we've looked at in this podcast. Okay, also called nationalist and conservative. Okay, you've got the more extreme nationalists, Okay, and the further you go towards the extreme, the most extreme form of nationalism, and we don't use this term until we get to the 20th century, but the most extreme form of nationalism is what we call fascism. Okay, and we'll look at that more because obviously the best example of a fascist was Hitler. And those most extreme form of nationalists what they did is they identified nation with race. Okay, they defined the nationality of a person not just by the language they spoke, but their biological makeup. So the more you move to the extreme right, the more you move to a racist form of nationalism, where national identity is is defined in terms of the biological makeup of that person. Okay, but you've also got, moving towards the centre, you've got more moderate forms of nationalism. Okay, now again, there's that dashed line here, and what the dashed line is basically saying is that once you move into this area here, you may be a nationalist, but you also take very seriously the issue of we bring about change peacefully, not using violence, but we bring about change peacefully through Parliament, by talking about it, by talking to the people we disagree with, not actually waging war against them. So moderate nationalists, we have them today. I mean, we have people today in Britain and in other democratic countries. We have political parties that are very proud of their country's heritage, but they are therefore nationalist. But they believe in democracy. They believe in parliamentary process, and that is absolutely fine. It is when we move towards extreme nationalism, where you believe that violence and war and stepping outside parliamentary process is a justifiable means of achieving your aims, that is where we start talking about fascism and radicalism and dangerous nationalist groups. Okay, so just expanding a little bit on that particular concept for you. So let's just quickly finish off then by going through the key points. Okay, right-wing nationalist-conservatives often believe that if you work hard you can keep your wealth. We call that capitalism. Class differences are therefore acceptable. Middle classes, who Marx called the bourgeoisie, therefore tend to support these ideas. Okay, and again that can include moderate groups. Okay, many people in Britain today would believe in these sort of ideas of, if you work hard you can keep your wealth. The right-wing groups tend to follow a more authoritarian mode, and that's a useful word for you there, an authoritarian model of government, where they say that there's nothing wrong with having power concentrated in the hands of a smaller group. Okay, they believe that this will lead to a more decisive and effective government. They disagree with the socialists, previous podcast, who argue that the masses, the large urban working classes, should be allowed to have some say in the running of the country, a greater say in the running of the country, moving towards the most extreme left wing, of course, which is all power is given to the workers. Well, right-wing groups will disagree with this. They will say that power will be diluted and that you've got to basically concentrate power in those who are more capable of ruling. Right-wing views tend to believe that people's loyalty should be to their nation, and that the working classes and the middle classes of one country should unite. They should work together to make the country strong. Moderate nationalists, okay, this group here, okay, believe that change should be brought about peacefully by elected political parties working through Parliament. Okay, and again, the German Parliament was the Reichstag. And that rulers should still be accountable to elected parliament. So in other words, the government, remember, always separate, government is different from parliament. Parliament is the large elected assembly, and the government is the small group that will decide policy. Government must give account to parliaments, and if parliaments do not agree with what the government is doing, then the government should step down and there should be another election. That's moderate nationalists. Usually we define nationality, right-wing groups would define nationality in terms of language and cultural tradition. Okay. Now again, an example in terms of Britain today, the Conservative Party, with a capital C, are on the right wing of politics. They're not extreme nationalists, they sit within the democratic area, but they are more on the right wing than, for example, the Labour Party, who sit more on the left wing. But again, in Britain today, our Labour Party is in that area here, it is moderate left wing. The extremist groups, communists and extreme nationalists, pretty much in Britain today, do not really exist, or they're very, very marginal radical groups that do not really have any influence in government or in Parliament. And our final slide. Extreme nationalists then believe that change can be brought about through a violent overthrow of the existing rulers. And in that sense, the extreme nationalists are very similar to the communists. Although they are opposite ends of the spectrum, what they have got in common is that belief that change can be brought about through violence. Secondly, they believe that rulers should not be accountable to an elected parliament. Okay. So again, if you've got that sort of idea of a government, okay, which is a small group, and sitting beneath it, you've got a parliament, which is a large group of elected representatives. So the government is a small assembly, the parliament is a large group. If you are a right-wing person, you believe that small group of government could consist of just maybe 15 people. The parliament may consist of 500 elected representatives. They would say that the rulers of a country, and the most extreme form is a fascist system where it is government by one man effectively. The rulers should not be accountable to an elected parliament, that elected parliament is dumbed down, it is giving too many people a say in the running of the country. So the most extreme form of nationalism is a dictatorship model of government. Okay, the dictatorship works best. Most people basically are incapable of leadership, and therefore we've got to leave it to the people who can do it. And the most extreme form is leadership by one man. Often, nationality, if defined in terms of race, we call that racism. Okay. Now, traditionally, nationalism is defined not in terms of race; it's defined in terms of language and culture. Okay. But the more extreme you move, the more you move to the extreme right, they define nationalism in terms of race. And from the 1920s onwards, extreme nationalists, in other words, those nationalists who defined nationality by race, were often called fascists. The fascist party in Germany were called the Nazis, and they took power in 1933. Now, don't use that word fascist until we actually get to the 1920s. Okay, the word did not exist until the 1920s in terms of politics. Okay, before the 1920s, talk about extreme nationalists. Okay, when you write the answers to this. Okay, fairly detailed explanation of that, but that's an important one because the right wing are an important element of the course. I hope that was useful to you. The third podcast coming up will be focusing on the middle area, the liberal area of politics. Thank you.